Okay, so this is joint work with Raphael, who's sitting over here. So the motivation for this paper is really to think about the standard model of accountability, or electoral accountability. Typically, we think about a principal, a voter, who's trying to control a single agent. Okay, he's trying to control a single agent or select a single agent. Okay? But if we think about most political situations of interest, what's happening there is there's an element of competition. So there's an agent, but there's also a prospective opponent who can replace that agent. And many situations of political interest actually are even more structured because you have the option of selecting one team or another. So here we have one example, which is, that we're going to focus on, which is where you have an incumbent cabinet, and that incumbent cabinet can be replaced by a shadow cabinet. So that's how I think about political competition in most parliamentary systems, where you have an incumbent team, and that team can be replaced by another one, by a prospective other team. So what we want to do is we want to focus on the account, or try and develop the accountability model to think about this competition between teams. Okay? So one of the main motivations for thinking about is this, how do I get the beamer thing working? Okay, it's not working. Okay.
Oh, maybe you right, anyway.
Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll point. So one of the main motivations for thinking for cabinet government is often this notion that if you have a team, and these team are performing, members of that team are performing similar tasks, you get to learn something about their competencies. Okay? And this is actually a common justification. Here's a quote from a paper in APSR by John Huber and Martinez Gallardo, which makes this point quite nicely. A principal is in charge of a team, and that team are all performing similar tasks, then the outcomes will allow the principal to learn something about the competences of that team. Okay, so that seems a common justification for cabinet government. And it's also the case that work that John Huber has done, and also work that I've done, suggests that when you look at the data is suggestive that something like this type of learning is going on. So if you look at the pattern of turnover in cabinets, of members of cabinets, it's as if a principal is using some kind of comparative evaluation to decide who remains in the team and who doesn't. Okay? But of course, that still leaves the question whether the existence of a team, structured as a cabinet, actually enhances accountability. Okay? So is cabinet a good way of learning about politicians' competencies? Okay? So that's really a theoretical question. So to answer that, we really need a theory. And so what we're going to do here is to build a model that has the ingredients that allows us to address that question. Okay? So we're going to have a team of decision makers, and we're going to have, that team is going to implement a policy, and that policy is going to reveal something about the member's competence. Okay? But then we're going to introduce a cabinet. And what the cabinet is going to do, we're going to think about a cabinet that consists of rent-seeking politicians, but those rent-seeking politicians are collectively going to choose which policies they're going to implement. Specifically, they're going to decide whether to choose policies that allow learning about their competencies. Okay? To that basic framework, we're then going to add some competition between two teams. We're going to think about that as a cabinet and a shadow cabinet. And we're going to compare it to a benchmark case, which would be the one where a team is appointed. Okay? Oh, and I keep going back instead of forwards. So here's some related literature. So clearly this relates to literature on learning, and Steve's written all of that, so you can ask him about that literature. The model we're going to use is our version of the multi-arm bandit model. In particular, it's going to be related to a paper by Strulovici in Chronometrica 2010. We're going to be thinking about inefficiencies and whether competition and electoral competition is efficient or not. So that clearly relates to the papers by Mask and Tirol and Keynes, Rowan, Heron and Schatz. The key thing we're going to add to accountability literature is this notion of an active challenger. That also exists in a paper by Ashworth and Schatz. The key difference between our framework and their framework is, in their framework, the challenger's action is allowing you to learn something about the incumbent's action. Here, we're going to have two different teams, so it's going to be a team competition, and what the voter's learning about is the relative competence of these two teams, okay, rather than learning something about the actions taken by the incumbent. Okay, so just to fix ideas, let's think about a very, very basic decision-making problem in teams, okay? So let's start with a team of n agents who are going to choose a policy in each of 2 periods. Each of these agents is going to be competent or not competent, and the prior probability that the agent is competent is going to be P. There are going to be 2 periods, and in each period the agent is going to choose either a safe policy or a reform policy. Okay? Now the reform policy is going to be successful if and only if the agent that implements it is competent. Okay? So timing is going to be the agent is going to choose a first period policy, the outcome is going to be revealed, then the agent has a choice of whether to delegate his policy to another member of the team. The remaining agents then choose a second period policy, again the outcome is revealed. Okay? What are the payoffs? Safe action is going to yield a constant payoff of 1. The reform action is going to yield a payoff of R greater than 1 if successful, that is if it's implemented by a competent politician, and 0 otherwise. And the agent's payoff is going to be the average policy payoff obtained by the team. Okay? So here on the left-hand figure, we're going to plot these outcomes in P and 1 over R space. So if you look at this dashed line here on the 45-degree diagonal, that's the line that gives us where PR is equal to 1. To the right of that line, PR is greater than 1, and to the left of that line, PR is less than 1. So PR is the expected value of implementing the reform policy. The red line, the green line, and the blue lines differentiate different sized teams. Okay, so the red line here is a team of size 1. To the right of that line, the agent is implementing the reform policy. To the left of that line, he's implementing the safe policy. So what you observe here, if you look at the red line, you observe that an individual agent would sometimes, in the first period, want to implement the reform policy, even though the expected first period payoff from doing so is less than 1. Why does he want to do that? Well, by doing that, he's going to learn something about his type. He's going to learn whether he's competent or not. And learning about his type, then it increases his expected second period payoff. If he learns that he's competent, he can then implement the reform policy again in the second period and get a higher payoff. Okay? And what we observe is that the implementation of the risky policy here is increasing in the first best scenario in the size of the team. Okay, so the left-hand figure is telling us what the first best scenario is, and it's telling us that the optimal learning is increasing in the size of the team. And that makes sense because as the team gets large, it's more likely that at least one member is competent. And if at least one member is competent, we can always give the decisions to that member of the team. Okay? And so this gives us kind of the intuition for how people have thought about cabinet government. Okay? So team learning allows us team decision making allows us to learn something about the competencies. But that's the first best. On the right-hand side, we're going to look at what are the individually optimal decisions taken. Okay? So to the right of the blue line, we have a situation where all members of the team, this is a team of size 10, are going to experiment. To the right of the green line, we have at least 3 members who are going to experiment. And to the right of the red line, we're going to have at least 1 member is going to experiment. By experiment, I mean choosing the reform policy. Okay? And so what we observe at higher levels of competence, even though it's optimal for everybody, the first best is that everybody implements the reform, what we're going to find is that at most one person is going to implement the reform. Okay? And this is precisely the free rider problem. Okay? It's related to what Marco was talking about earlier. The free rider problem, what's happening here is that members of the team are not internalizing the positive effects of their investment in the risky reform on their other members of the team. Okay? So we're not saying anything new here. What we're saying here is that teams are subject to free riding, and this, of course, we already know from literature from Bolton Harris in 99 in particular. Okay? No, exactly. So here I'm not losing anything because my payoff is the average of the team. Okay, so now let me think about cabinet. Okay, so let me think, how does introducing a cabinet here in a more structured way mitigate free riding? Okay, and in particular, introducing a cabinet is going to mitigate free riding precisely because we're now going to have members of the team who are going to get individual payoffs from holding office. There's going to be a rent that I get from holding office. That's one component. The second component is there's going to be a collective decision-making rule. And as far as we know, cabinets operate under the unanimity principle. Okay, so we all have to agree to what the policy is that's implemented. Okay, and those two things are going to help us mitigate free riding. Well, we think this is going to help us mitigate free riding. Okay, so let's now think about the same model, but a model with a cabinet rather than a team. Okay, so now we're going to have a team of politicians who are going to choose policy under unanimity. Otherwise, most of the ingredients are going to be the same. So each agent is going to be competent or not, 2 periods, and each period the agent is going to choose safe or reform. Reform policy is successful only if competent. The timing is the same, except now we're going to have a cabinet rather than a team choosing policy. And now the payoffs, a safe policy is going to yield a constant payoff of 1 to the politician, and the reform is going to yield a payoff of R greater than 1 if successful, and 0 otherwise. And that's going to be an individual payoff that the politician receives. Okay, so this is a way of capturing the fact that there are rents from office. In a very simple, reduced form way, this captures there's a rent for office. Okay. So here we've got the voter's payoff is the average payoff, policy payoff obtained by the team, but for this first example, let's ignore the voter for now. Okay. Okay, so in the same way as before, to the right of the blue curve, we have all members of the team are going to experiment. To the of a team of size 10 are going to experiment. To the right of the green curve, all members of a team of size 3 are going to experiment. To the right of the red curve, all members of a team of size 1 are going to experiment. Okay? So what we observe, straightforwardly, we're going to eliminate free riding here because the unique equilibrium is going to be in symmetric strategies. Okay, so we're all either going to reform or not, just from our setup. But what we observe here is less reform for large teams, and this is now especially the case for low levels of competence. So the free riding problem was really at higher levels of competence. Here what we observe is less reform in large teams, especially for low levels of competence. So introducing a cabinet, it's getting rid of the free rider problem, fine, but we're still not getting any learning from teams here. Okay? So why is this? What's going on here? Because this as an example of a type of hold-up problem. What's going on here is that a politician who's revealed as incompetent is going to veto the further reform. So if I'm revealed as incompetent, I know that if we implement the reforms in the next period, I'm going to get a payoff of 0. Okay? If we implement the safe policy, I'm going to get a payoff of 1. Since I can veto the reform, that means that the benefit of learning from a politician occurs only when all members of the team are going to be revealed as competent. Okay? But of course that then reduces the value of the first period investment in the reform policy for all politicians. So this is an example that you can think about this as a type of hold-up problem. Okay? But it's a type of hold-up problem that has a very simple solution. So the problem here is caused by the bargaining power of politicians who are revealed as incompetent. Okay? But we have a resolution for that. We can just get rid of it. Okay? We could allow a party leader or a prime minister, anybody who reveals themselves to be incompetent, we could allow them to take them out of the team. So suppose that we do that. Suppose that we remove the cause of the hold-up problem. Suppose that the party or leader can remove incompetent politicians, so they've taken the reform action, they've revealed themselves to be incompetent, and we're going to assume that the politician is going to receive 0 when out of office, because these are office-seeking politicians. Then we find that the cabinet is going to invest, no matter what the size of the cabinet, it's going to invest in the reform action only in the event where the expected first period payoff is greater than 1. In other words, we eradicate all learning. So what's going on here is, so it is the case that if I'm a competent politician, I've revealed myself to be competent. It's also the fact that, ex ante, if Andrea has revealed himself to be incompetent, I would like him to be removed from the cabinet because he's going to veto the reform. But ex ante, also, I don't know my competence. So it could be that I'm the one who's revealed as incompetent. And if I'm the one who's revealed as incompetent, I'm going to be out of office. But I can only be out of office if I've revealed my incompetence, and that can only happen if we choose the risky option. Okay, so collectively, we're going to shy away from the risky option because that's going to reveal something about us. Okay? So here then, in this cabinet situation, we're going to get no learning whatsoever. Okay? So the first kind of point here is that just the institution of cabinet, it does get rid of free riding, but it induces this other problem, the hold-up problem, which limits learning. In fact, here it would eradicate learning. Okay? But that's just thinking about the cabinet in terms of these key institutions. Okay? So we're thinking about cabinet as an institution in which we have unanimity amongst office-holding politicians. Okay?
Given that everybody has speed of power, it's
right.
very important.
It's very important, yeah. So we could think about cabinets under different rules. So we could think about more generally different decision-making rules, but we know that cabinets, in principle, they work under unanimity. So the convention of collective responsibility imposes a unanimity principle. Okay? So unanimity is a reasonable thing to impose here, but you're absolutely right. Of course, it's different. It's driven by the collective decision-making rule, which is unanimity. Okay. So then, so we have this notion that cabinets allow us to learn, but in this example, we didn't.
Rather than change the original, could you change the criteria for removing somebody from cabinet? Let's say you take the bottom half of the performance and throw them out. So if they turn out to be the bottom half of the performance, like say policy, you throw them out anyway. So that would motivate people that do those certain.
The thing is, you don't learn anything when you play the safe policy.
That's my question. My question is, suppose the rule is not, if you reveal incompetence, you're thrown out. Rather, the rule is, you throw out the bottom half of people in terms of their performance. So if you're in a situation where nobody experiments, then you're fine. Then you have a chance of leaving anyway. If somebody experiments and you don't, and they're successful, then you're toast basically. So would that supply some motivation for learning in that context? That's my question.
Right, but that would have to allow the teams to implement different policies here. Okay. So here we're doing what all either going to choose safe or what all either going to choose. Okay. Because we have to unanimously agree. Okay. Now, of course, we could think about different unanimous rules where we unanimously agree that some of us do safe and some of us do this. So now, okay, so it could be, nevertheless, that there's still a learning component to cabinet government, but what's happening here is precisely due to this competitive aspect. Okay? It could be that that's what's allowing us to learn. So then we're going to explore, well, what happens if we actually have rival teams? Okay? Now, of course, this is kind of tricky. So how are you going to induce kind of team competition into this framework? Well, we're going to do it in a very, very reduced form way, and you may or may not like it, but this is what we've got. Okay? So now we're going to have, instead of one team of politicians, we're going to have two teams of politicians. Okay? And we're also going to have a voter. And the voter is going to select between these two teams. Okay? As before, the agents are competent or not. There are two periods. In each period, the incumbent cabinet is going to choose safe or reform, and the reform policy is successful only if the agent is competent. Okay? But now the timing is a bit different. The cabinet is going to choose the first period policy and the outcome is revealed, but now we're going to have a shadow cabinet. And the shadow cabinet is going to choose a platform. And when it chooses its platform is going to be safe or risky, the outcome, that is the competence of each of its members, is going to be revealed with some probability. Okay? And I'll motivate this a little bit better in a minute. Okay? Then the voter is going to select between these two teams, according to what is observed about their competencies, and then whoever the cabinet is in the second period is going to implement policy. Okay? The payoffs are going to be the same as before. Safe yields a constant payoff of 1, reform yields are greater than 1, successful 0. Otherwise, if not in office, then the politician receives 0, because there's a possibility of replacement, and if a party leader had the option, he would always do so, given that the voter is going to evaluate the competence of these teams. Okay. So let me just motivate this notion of thinking about the role of the shadow cabinet in this way, okay? So, as I said, after period 1, the incumbent cabinet is going to implement a policy, and the outcome is going to be revealed. So we're going to know something about the competence of the incumbents if they choose a reform policy, okay? So now let's think that the shadow cabinet is going to decide to stand on a safe or reform platform. So imagine there's something like a campaign. So if they choose to stand on a reform platform, let's say they're going to implement budget cuts, or they're going to do something radical. Doing so allows the voter to learn something about that politician's plan. If they think they're going to stand on the status quo or the safe policy, then essentially the voter is going to learn nothing. So the notion is that there are some policy platforms that allow the voter to learn something about the opposition team's competencies. Okay? So when they choose reform, the competence of the shadow members is revealed with some probability QS. And so what we're going to do for the talk is look at two extreme cases. So one case we're going to think about as a non-competitive election. And that's essentially just the standard accountability model, where whatever the shadow cabinet does, it's ignored by the voter. So we're going to set QS equal to 0. And then we're going to look at the other extreme, where the voter is going to treat what he learns from the shadow cabinet as being equivalent to what he would learn from the incumbent cabinet if they implemented the policy. Okay, so these are the extreme cases, and obviously the truth is somewhere in between. You can think, it seems unrealistic that the voter's not going to learn anything from the shadow cabinet's announcements or pronouncements, but it also is unrealistic that it's going to learn just as much as if they implemented policy. But nevertheless, just to get your intuition, we're going to look at this case. Okay? But all of our results are going to hold for some Q in this interval. So let's first of all think about what the optimal behavior is for the voter. I probably lost this a long while ago. So what's the optimal behavior for the voter? Well, the voter, he's going to simply elect the team that has a higher posterior probability of being competent. Okay? Now, of course, there are going to be many situations where the voter's not going to learn anything. Okay, so if they both choose safe, both teams choose safe, the voter doesn't know anything, so he's indifferent between them. And it's also the case that if they both teams choose the reform policy, and an equal number of politicians on both sides are successful, then also the voter would be indifferent. Okay. So when that's the case, of course, we also then have a continuity of equilibria. Okay. But just to fix some ideas, we're going to assume, first of all, that in that situation, the voter's just going to split the indifference equally. Okay, so he's going to select each team with probability of half. Okay. Okay. So now let's think about what's the cabinet going to do in the case with an inactive shadow. So we're setting QS equal to 0. Okay. And as before, it's to the right of this green curve that they're going to implement the reform policy, to the left of that green curve that they're going to play safe. The other curve that we see here is what would happen if the cabinet were appointed for 2 periods. Okay? Yeah, so, oops. Right, so this is to the right of this curve here. This is what the incumbent cabinet are doing. And this is what an appointed cabinet would do. Whoops. Okay.
What is your question about the assumption that the voters just randomize the equal probability if they're indifferent? I mean, presumably there would be, you didn't do that, you're going to get independent equilibrium.
Yeah, no,
so
exactly. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about that.
The probability that would make the voters best off?
Yes, no, we will. Exactly, we will. But I just want to look at this case first, just to see exactly whether doing that the voter gets what he wants, and then we'll see what the problem is. Then we'll see, well, given the problem, what can the voter do optimally, and then we'll go that way instead. Okay?
So just to clarify, I thought that if there was already one incompetent person in the second period, vetoes the reform.
Sorry?
If there is one incompetent person in the second period, it vetoes the reform.
Yeah.
So after the first period, the voter chooses between the cabinet and the shadow cabinet.
Yeah.
There is one
So this is
voter, it doesn't
this is true. So of course, okay. So of course, in that case, the voter should always be indifferent between these. Okay, because he's not. Okay. So what we're going to assume there, the assumption we're going to make here is that he's always going to choose the team that he thinks is most competent. Okay. Okay. Now you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. In the 2-period model, this doesn't make any sense. But in a 3-period model, that would be the optimal thing to do. So think about a world where the voter is unsure whether the game is going to continue to 3 periods, then it would be optimal for him to select the competent to use that rule. Okay. But you're right. I mean, you're right. Actually, strictly speaking, in a 2-period model, the voter should be indifferent because the incompetent politician is always going to veto reform, so then they're going to choose the same policy. So it's a slight fix to say, okay, in that, he's going to break that indifference by choosing the team with the highest competence, but that would be the optimal thing to do if there was some chance for 3rd period. Okay, but we want to at least fix the results for the 2 periods first, and then we'll see what happens in 3 periods in the extension, okay? And so it turns out that actually this appointment curve is the optimal thing for the voter, and the reason why it's the optimal thing for the voter is that the only distortion between the voter and the politician is the rent-seeking component of the politician, okay? So then if you do the comparison with appointment, what we observe is that at high levels of competence, now we're going to get overinvestment in the risky reform. Okay? And at low levels of competence, we're going to get underinvestment in the risky reform. Okay? So the underinvestment is coming from the fact that the team of politicians, they don't want to reveal themselves as incompetent because they're going to get kicked out of office. Okay? So they'd rather play safe and reveal nothing. Okay? So that's fairly straightforward. What's happening at the higher levels of competence? Well, now they really want to showcase their talent. Okay? So it's a case that there's an opposition team that can come in, their average competence is P. If our average competence, if we can reveal ourselves to be competent, then the voter is going to select us. Okay? So this is what we think of as showcasing. Okay? So this could be, well, this is here an example of inefficiency, but it's precisely because the voter is using a particular, we fixed the voter to use a particular rule and we don't know whether that's optimal. Okay? Okay? So, but now we know exactly what the problem is, we can think about, well, what might the voter want to do? Okay? Okay? So let's think about the situations precisely where the voter is indifferent. Okay? So he's going to be indifferent in two circumstances. So one is when the cabinet plays safe and he learns nothing. Okay? The other is when the cabinet plays reform, all of their members are revealed as being non-competent and they're replaced. In those two scenarios, the voter is strictly indifferent. Okay? And as we said, then there are many sequentially rational strategies that the voter can use. Okay? But of course now the voter could do something a bit more sophisticated. So what he could do is he could punish a cabinet that plays safe for low levels of P. And he could do so by saying, since I'm indifferent, if you play safe, I'm never going to elect you. Okay? Similarly, he could reward a cabinet that plays safe at higher levels of P. Okay? So he could say, so in the event where you're of high competence, you play safe, I'm going to elect you with probability 1. Again, the voter can do that because he's strictly indifferent. Okay? And doing that then recovers efficiency. Okay, recovers first best. So this proposition says that when PR is less than 1, so the more interesting case, and the voters use their votes to both select incumbents and to sanction their performance, then these non-competitive elections are equivalent to the efficient benchmark. Okay? When PR is greater than 1, non-competitive elections are strictly well for improving with respect to the benchmark case. Why is that? Well, when PR is greater than 1, you're always investing in the reform project, but with elections, you're learning something about the competence of the politicians, and you can weed out the incompetent ones, okay, which obviously you can't do under appointment. Okay, so when PR is greater than 1, it's obviously going to be the case that elections are going to be superior. Okay. So now let's think about whether the voter can do the same thing when there's a team. Well, sorry, when there's competition between teams. Okay, so now let's have an active shadow cabinet. So for this case, we're going to think about QS as being equal to 1. Okay, so now we have the same curves as before. So the thick green curve to the right of that, this is where the incumbent cabinet is investing in the reform policy. Now we've got this dashed green curve as well. That's breaking up the region where the incumbent cabinet is playing safe. To the left of that curve, the shadow cabinet is playing safe as well. To the right of that curve, that's where the shadow cabinet is playing risky. Okay? But what you observe here is something similar to what we observed in the earlier case. You're still getting underinvestment and overinvestment in the risky, in the risky platform relative to the appointment case. Okay? So too much reform for high P, and in particular, you've still got this showcasing of talent. Okay? So the question now is, well, suppose in this environment, we allowed the voter to do the optimal thing. Can we get rid of those inefficiencies? Okay, so this comes a little clearer on these graphs here. So the left-hand graph here, well, it would do if the coloring were correct, or were showing up more clearly. So what you should be seeing here on the left-hand side and the right-hand side is an area that's white, an area that's green, and an area that's red. I don't know if that looks like green, but it should be, the slightly darker region is green, okay? The white areas where appointment and competitive elections are equivalent. The green areas are where the competitive elections are superior to appointment, and the red areas where the inefficiencies are. Okay? The left-hand figure is the case where the voter is just splitting the indifference equally, so those are the inefficiencies we had. The right-hand graph is showing what happens when the voter uses the optimal retention scheme. And so what we observe is that we still have this showcasing. We can't get rid of the showcasing. Okay? So it's still the case that the incumbent cabinet is over-investing in reforms. Okay? And so it's not the case that the voter in his optimal retention scheme can control the incumbent team to eradicate that inefficiency. And so why is that? Well, the first thing is that the voter now can't commit to rewarding safe behavior. And the reason why he can't commit to rewarding safe behavior is now there's an active shadow cabinet. And the active shadow cabinet, well, what they can do is they can promise to implement reforms, and if they reveal themselves to be competent, then the voter will select the shadow cabinet over the cabinet. So the voter can no longer commit to rewarding safe behavior, but she can still punish risk in the case where the teams are evenly matched. Okay, so if it's still the case that if both of the teams are proposing reforms, and there's an equal number of politicians on each side who've revealed themselves to be competent, then it's still the case that the voter could punish risk by choosing the cabinet with probability zero, the incumbent cabinet with probability zero. But of course, as the cabinet grows large, the likelihood of this tie becomes small. Okay, so that gives us this proposition: when teams have strictly more than one member, inefficiencies in the competitive elections cannot be totally eradicated. In fact, in the limit, as the team size grows large, these inefficiencies occur whenever p is greater than half. So in the limit, as the team is growing large, these inefficiencies are occurring irrespective of what the value of the reform is. Okay? So whenever p is greater than half, the cabinet is going to showcase its talent, and the magnitude of this inefficiency is going to be low. Okay?
It's hard to motivate that shadow cabinet can actually deal with their competence, because they're not actually implementing it.
No,
They're suggesting a policy.
No, I agree.
So you may learn about whether the policy is the right one or not the right one, because perhaps the cabinet is implementing the opposite policy. At least you learn the opposite, the wrong one. But it's hard to think that they actually showcase their own particular ability.
The question is whether you, because the key thing here is that we're going to say the voter learns with probability 1 the competence of the incumbent team, and he's going to learn with some lower probability what the competence of the shadow cabinet is. But what you're telling me is you think it's 0. You think they learn nothing from the policy choices.
About ability of implementation. I think they may learn about what's the right policy. Think about model in which there is a safe word, it's not the right policy.
Fine. I mean, here he No, I agree. So I don't agree it's full cheap talk. That's the difference. Okay. So your position, I think, is quite extreme, saying, well, whatever they say, we're not learning anything about them. Okay, no matter what policy they choose. So our claim is that there are some policies that the shadow cabinet are going to choose, and they're going to have to justify those policies in a way that's going to reveal something about their type. Okay, so the outcome is an interaction between the policy they choose and their competence, and so that allows the voter to learn. And okay, if your position is the voter learns nothing, then we can't use this framework to evaluate competition either between individuals or teams. Okay, so we have to think about another way.
Should the cabinet be taking actually actions that show their own ability?
Yeah, because you're learning the competence of individual members, right?
Yeah. So one example, but I don't know the details, but maybe is when I think it was President Bush when he said it was Bush when he said he was going to reform the bureaucracy in some way, and then they asked him, so exactly what reforms are you going to implement? And he kind of fluffed on the answer, and his answer revealed the fact that he didn't actually know what the maybe I'm good.
The Republican primaries also we saw now. Like, I don't remember who it was that he was asked, okay, I'm going to slash 3 departments.
This was
It was Rick Perry.
Yeah.
So
you're revealing this.
That's true.
Well, he could have said something really banal, and then you would have learned nothing. He could have said, I'm going to defend the country or whatever. He could have said something completely banal and he said learn nothing. The fact that he said, well, we're going to implement these reforms, and then people start, well, so exactly how are you going to implement them? Then you're learning something about how much he is in control of his brief. And so we think here, so when the minister says, okay, now we're going to implement this radical reform, we'll justify it, and he can't justify it, then you understand whether he's in control of his brief or not. That's it.
You can make the case of anything, right? Anything you say at any moment then reveals a bit of who you are.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, so I think that the bottom line is it's very tricky to think about how you can introduce competition in these models. This is one way, and so our stance is that there is something that you learn via the policy choice, and I think it's a kind of extreme view to say that you learn nothing from the policy choice about the competence, but
You might say that there's some evidence in some cases of past experience or something like that, that some of these people have been captains before,
Right.
in other cases.
sure, in a more kind of fully fleshed out dynamic framework, we could maybe think about
The
these.
leader, for example, indicating who might be the shadow cabinet. The shadow cabinet is already composed in some cases of people who
replace.
But all that is
people
black
in the
box.
second period.
That's all black
But
box.
in some sense, it's also like I think some junior, like promising positions are first put in the shadow cabinet and tested that. That way to.
Well, I mean, essentially, shadow cabinet is a government in waiting. So, you know, whoever's there, we know they're going to be. So they have to kind of prove themselves in some way. And one way they can prove themselves is precisely through their policy development. So that's the kind of idea we have. You prove yourself through your policy development, but of course, if you just stick with the existing policies, there's not much you learn. Okay, you just say, I'm going to implement the same policies that are there, you don't learn much. Okay, I mean, let's. Yeah. So I just want to. How much time do I have? I'm actually not going to need. I'm not going to need. Well, I'm not going to. So I'm going to go through some of your findings and maybe then one other application. Okay, so what we find is that free rider problem in teams with high P. Okay. Cabinets can resolve this issue, but they can resolve the free riding issue, but they induce this thing which we refer to as a hold-up problem. I don't know if economists like to think about this as a hold-up problem, but I think it has elements of a hold-up problem to it. Okay. Our elections with optimal retention can alleviate this hold-up problem, but actually competitive elections still introduce this showcasing element and overinvestment in reforms, and what we showed was that in our framework, elections can't get rid of this showcasing, so we can get overinvestment in reform. Okay, so I want to finish up by thinking about another application. Okay, so there are some ingredients to what we're doing that are kind of more general. Okay, so we're looking at a particular team competition in a political environment, but some of these things are, some of the ingredients of our model or some of the ingredients of our framework are a bit more general. So let's think about what they are, okay? So here we've got team members who value their position, okay? And we've got a team that can play safe tactics or adopt reform, okay? And successful reform yields a higher payoff, but the outcome of the reform reveals the competence of the members of the team, and some team members can veto reform. Okay, so those are the kind of general ingredients we're looking at in a particular example. So here's another, perhaps more important application to these ideas. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, so this is a football club, Chelsea, who are actually the greatest team the world has ever seen, and they are also European champions. In case you didn't know that. Okay. So what happened at Chelsea at the start of the season? So in my world, actually, everything is. Even though I talk about politics, everything is actually about football. So let me explain this example here. So at the start of the season, Chelsea introduced this dashing, brilliant new manager, André Villas-Boas. Okay? What Villas-Boas wants to do is he wants to implement this new, radically new way of playing. Okay? And everyone agrees that if he implements this radical new way of playing, this will yield a success. Okay, so the team has an established way of playing. He wants to introduce this new tactics, and this will be successful if, this will be a successful outcome if it's implemented correctly. However, the outcome really depends on whether the existing members of the team have the competence or the ability or the talent to implement these new tactics. Okay? Now what happened was that senior members of the team vetoed the implementation of those reforms. Okay, so you have their members of the team, they value their position. This team, they could continue playing the way they always did, or they could adopt the new radical tactics. Successful reform would have yielded a higher payoff to them. The problem is the outcome of the reform would reveal a competence. So by implementing these new tactics, you're going to reveal which players are flexible and which ones aren't. And so what happens then is some team members, in this case it wasn't unanimity, it was just a group of senior players very visibly just vetoed the implementation of the tactics. Okay? But of course, so one thing, more serious side of this application is what's different about politics is precisely the competition. Okay, so this is a very kind of team-constrained situation, but the difference in the political example is precisely this interaction between the cabinet and the shadow cabinet. I don't really know if this is very useful, but I thought I'd introduce it anyway. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
But there's still the best now.
They are, undoubtedly, the greatest team the world has ever seen.